All right, so our second presentation will come from artist and educator Christina P. Day. Christina Day's art practice recontextualizes roles related to material lifespan: designer, fabricator, owner, maintainer. Her building language stems from the study of textile design strategy and architecture. Day is a full-time faculty member in the fiber department at the Maryland Institute College of Art here in Baltimore. Recent research projects that she's undertaken and exhibitions have been completed at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Arlington, Virginia, the Commonweal Gallery in Philadelphia, the Winterthur Museum, Garden and Library in Wilmington, Delaware, and the Kirkcaldy Museum in Kirkcaldy, Scotland. I recently had the opportunity to see a show of Christina's in Arlington at the Museum of Contemporary Art, and it was just fascinating. And I was so compelled by her work. Visit her website, we'll drop it in the chat. Obviously she's not a jewelry artist, but we love the way that she was encountering the idea of place. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Christina.
Thank you so much, Jane, for the invitation to participate in this. I'm calling in from Philadelphia today, and I found in the drafting of this presentation that I put together, what's amazing about an invitation like this, as somebody who operates in a field that I consider to be adjacent to jewelry and metalsmithing. I work in fiber, and I have both my undergrad and my grad degrees are both on this topic, and I work in a fiber department as a full-time faculty member. It's really interesting to know that I'm speaking to a room full of jewelers when I talk about materiality the way that I'm going to. My original contact point with this topic came through being in the crafts department at University of the Arts in Philadelphia. Unfortunately, that department is no longer, but that left a huge mark on a lot of undergrads who were lucky enough to study there in the 80s to the 90s. So. And also into the 2000s, there's a long legacy of really important work that's come out of that department. So I just want to name them first because that had a huge influence on me as an artist. I'm going to share my screen and bring over this presentation. Okay, so you can see this okay? Are we good to go?
It looks great.
Thank you so much. Okay, so I just want to start off by saying basically what I began with there about coming from a crafts background and teaching in fiber and speaking to a room that is full of jewelers today. This puts me in an interesting context to frame my work as a study of material and function, and also its relationship to the body. My definition of craft and how I work with it is very expansive. I'm starting off with two pictures that I found at a junkyard, actually, that frame together a distance view of one space that I do not know. These pictures are not mine. They were found out of context, and thinking in this way of putting fragments back together again leads me through a lot of how I work. I think of place as being defined by moment and also by person. I think of objects as being a form of eulogy and surface as a form of surrogate. I'm going to show you a bunch of collected objects that I have that are that I've been collecting over the years from both flea markets and through inherited circumstances and things like that, that I think speak to place and time in an interesting way. I'm not going to really explain much about why I have these things or whose they are or what function they served, but I find them to be really informative to my art practice at large. This is a World's Fair brass souvenir envelope that I found from 1939, which was found in Adamstown, Pennsylvania in 2016. This is a Ford card advertisement audio postcard that you could actually play back on a record player to listen to a commercial, an audio commercial. An artificial leg patent model from 1860 by J.W. Newbert. This is a picture that was taken from the Hagley Museum and Library in Wilmington, Delaware, which has an amazing archive of patented objects. Newspaper print plates as a positive and a negative. These would have been used to print as a tool onto a newspaper for wide distribution. Skeletonized leaves, which was considered to be a Victorian craft at one point to sort of pulverize all of the plant matter from a leaf and to capture it only in its skeletal form. These types of objects tend to have like a sort of X-ray type of view. and they're unbelievable to see in person. This is a picture that was lifted from a book when I was at the Wilmington Museum as a maker-creator on a maker-creator fellowship this past summer. I put in these two photographs because I found this particular book, which has left a pretty huge mark on me. I think about photography in a way that has to do with its relationship to craft and the objecthood of a camera, but also the way that a camera is capable of freezing a particular moment in time between two people or a person and a subject matter. This picture, while it looks like there's not much in it, actually has a capture of time that I find to be quite complex. I'm just going to read you a quote here that came from this particular book called The Tasteful Interlude, American Interiors Through the Camera's Eye, 1860 to 1917 by William Seal. I found this book while also over the summer at the Winterthur Library, which is a deep archive of American decorative art and also product design history and patent history. So many things live in that archive. Here's the quote that's about this picture. Gaslighting was inadequate illumination for photographing rooms, so the photographer had to depend on light from open windows. Otherwise, he needed to take time exposures which could last for hours, and for that reason could never include people. During a time exposure, the photographer moved in and out of the picture, constantly adjusting window curtains and reflectors to attract maximum light. If he did not remain too long in one place, his image was lost. Most of the pictures here, which were taken prior to the turn of the century, were probably time exposures of anywhere from a matter of seconds to several hours. There's something about this photograph that holds more information than what we can see. I really feel like our understanding of what photography is today is largely framed by the speed at which we have access to it. It's hard to comprehend a time when a capture of an image like this took way longer than what we understand now. I found this picture to be quite fascinating as well, partially because this book, for the most part, was a study of American interiors, and rarely do you actually find a person sitting within the landscape. I found this to be kind of amazing because this means that in order for this picture to have been captured, this woman would have needed to have been sitting there for a longer period of time than we can really understand. And to also understand how darkness and lightness works in that type of setting when electrical light was not necessarily how things were lighting the room. I have a relationship to craft in the way that I think about materiality as being a mirror. And I also think about, because of mirroring, the relationship to twinning that materials can have. And what this means has to do with being or remembering that materials, especially architectural materials or interior materials, kind of hold a charge of the people that have been there before you. I've been thinking a lot about how surfaces can bounce memories back. This started in around 2005 when I began with a project literally working on top of mirrors, where I was putting photographs back in place of an experience that I had had looking through a window. The idea was to use photography for its sort of instantaneous relationship to time, but also to project it and physically connect it to materials that have a longer history attached to them. This has walked me through all kinds of interpretations of projecting a window onto a space where it's not supposed to be, or using an object as an idea to look through something or look back through something. This obviously is a Polaroid camera, and it's encased in several layers of paint and also a piece of wraparound trim, which is sort of like a divided light on top of like what you'd see through a window pane in an architectural building. This is encased in many, many layers of paint, which is a vocabulary I come back to often in my practice that has to do with painting things fresh over and over and over again, partially until the details of the architecture lose their sharpness, and there's sort of a history that's built into the piece. It seals itself in as a part of it. I look for twinning everywhere. I live in South Philadelphia in Pennsylvania, and that's a language of row homes for anyone who might be calling in from outside the United States. That's a tradition in northeastern cities of houses that hold side-by-side relationships with each other, meaning that party walls are shared on the right and left sides of the buildings. Occasionally, you'll come across a house that actually literally has like two eyes, or if you think of it like two eyebrows. There's symmetry to the building, meaning two entrances for two people. There's something about like the side-by-side nature of this that I find to be quite compelling. As somebody who speaks through architecture and building, I think about revival, rescue, and making as being an equation I like to put together in my work. for a period of time, I actually worked as an architectural historic preservation worker on a team where we were literally re-establishing details that were around the city on houses that were deemed of historic depth and of historic value. This meant that we would be taking pieces of trim that were largely weathered off of the side of a house, and then we would restore them with a marine grade epoxy that was something that you'd mix together. It would harden to this consistency where you could actually carve it like a piece of wood and cut it on a table saw, much the same way that wood would function. I thought it was kind of amazing that we were reviving these pieces of wood that were probably created in the late 1800s. And it was the type of construction that was only made or it was made once to last. So to return to something that needs its structure back in this type of way was kind of an amazing job to have. I felt like I was repairing, like it was like dental work in a weird way in an architectural sense, which actually brings me over to something I'm about to say in relation to architecture and the body, because I think of like in just having listened to Demi's talk about the body always being present. In my work, I think of the body as being a part of architecture and the relationship that architecture has to the body, literally, quite literally, physically. This is a picture actually that I took mid-project where we were repairing a downspout drain that came off of a house to basically escort water to the end of the house where it would reach a downspout to get the rain off of the roof. You'll notice on the left, that's the repaired part, and on the right, that's what it looked like when we got there. But more importantly, this picture was taken from a point of view that does not exist anymore. I was really blown away by the fact that while I was on that scaffolding unit, I was standing in a place that no one is supposed to stand. I was also standing in the same spot of the original builder that laid the tiles on top of the roof. Standing in impossible spaces like this is also something that marks my moment of remembering something, remembering where I was when I was working on it, and remembering whose other footsteps I'm standing in. This has impacted the type of sculptures that follow when I think about the work that like as an artist, you can't really take your art goggles off, as I like to say, meaning that I can walk into different building circumstances and jobs for things, but I can't take off the reaction I'm going to have or how I'm going to metabolize the experience of being a builder in this type of setting. Those two houses that I just showed that were side by side had a connecting second story window that was just a pocket window that connected two houses together over a breezeway. In the process of that time when I was there, which was around 2008, I believe, Temple University, which is part of North Philadelphia, was starting to break these buildings down, partially because they were getting sold by the owners and being taken in by the school to turn into dormitory housing for students, which meant that they were actually leveling some of these buildings. But the buildings themselves, which were built by Frank Furness in the late 1800s, actually worked like a repeat pattern moving down a city block, meaning that one house led to the second story window, which led to the second story window, which led to the next house. And there was, if you opened one or took one building down, ultimately you opened up a hole to the next one. This led me to have a reaction to make this two-sided window that was a mirror image of itself, where the inside was out and outside was in. I'm interested really in making architectural sculptural work that's about the space in between things, particularly in an architectural language. Objects that I've collected along the way that I believe speak to this as well have to do with absent bodies. I found this amazing women's diagnostic dental cast in a junkyard, and I've like still can't stop thinking about this. I have a large collection of objects that are really quite curious of other people's history. The relationship of repair, I think, has an interesting correlation from the images I just showed you from architecture to this, where you can see that one area of the mouth of the jaw would have been worked on and the other was just holding its place. The interesting thing about a dental mold like this is that it's a perfect fit. I think sometimes we forget that like our own bodily architecture has an amazing amount of fit to it. I've been thinking about twins and finding an echo of a person inside of an object. Again, this was more clothing and objects that I found in a junkyard experience that I had at a special residency in Philadelphia called Rare, which is in the Northeast Tacony neighborhood, which is not far actually where for those of us in the United States, you may have heard that moment when the highway fell down and on Highway 95. That junkyard is not far from that area. This was a Halston pump that I found that I wanted to remake. I do have the pair of both of them, but I wanted to show this picture because I think It speaks to where twins can be found. I'm interested in producthood and finding doubles of things under unlikely circumstances. Within several days of being at that residency, I found this same, almost to the date, vacuum cleaner twice, which was mind-blowing to me. This is the type of place where estate sweeps will drop all of their things. Construction projects that are leveling a building, a theater set that is getting striked down from its performance. All kinds of circumstances bring people to bring their materials to this site. But I was still blown away by the fact that in such an unusual needle in a haystack kind of situation, that doubles can be found under really impossible circumstances. It says something about time. Things that I found in other people's things. This is a wallet that I found that had this quote inside of it. I do my thing and you do your thing. I am not in this world to live up to your expectations, and you are not in this world to live up to mine. You are you and I am I. And if by chance we find each other, it's beautiful. If not, it can't be helped. Finding things like this has me looking for what I like to call long-term love and missing information in objects. This has shown up in photographs that I found that are other people's. I don't know these people, but I find I understand these photos somehow. I understand the style. I also really love studying other people's version of fabulous. I think this is amazing because if you think about what's going on in this photograph, that little girl is probably wearing her grandmother's wig. This has led me to think about objects that are fragments of place. I'm just going to see if I can drag this over. Yes, I can. Okay. This is a fragment of a post of a staircase, actually, a staircase railing and post that came from the first house that I lived in with my husband. This is upholstery fabric that was inherited from my family. This is made of a couch that literally no longer exists anymore. I grew up with this upholstery. I know this upholstery when I'm not in front of it. There's something about inheriting fabric and using it in this context as a skin over architecture. Wall is body and sightline is memory. I think about the aesthetic of being home when no one is there. I think a lot about the absent body. In South Philadelphia, this is a common aesthetic of a glowing doorbell, which I've always had an affinity for. My understanding of, or my relationship to jewelry really comes from collage, and it has to do with extracting and piercing and cutting things away in sort of an intense manner. This is a removed crystal doorknob set that has the lock still attached to it with an extracted wallpaper pattern that I cut very exactly down to just the positive of the print. And I laid this lacy structure back over the top of the object to have a perfect alignment point. There's a relationship that I think that's inside of my work that has to do with photography and sightlines. It started really early on in this work, which was from around 2011, when I was trying to project a sense of place onto a fixed object. I have a fascination with trying to put things back that are lost, if you will. This is turned into a bunch of things that along the way have found surfaces in unlikely places, or I like to blend functions and products, or to remix the metaphors of what's possible with an object that's no longer on or not plugged in. This is a 45 record player that is also a piece of luggage, which I always thought was an interesting concept, with another projection of hand-cut wallpaper projected over the top. When you look over the top of it at an exact angle, you can see that all the alignments line up. So it does feel like a physical projection over a solid object. I'm interested in words that cross between family and architecture. Sistering is a phrase that's used to explain when you need to sister one joist to another, you're making it stronger in an architectural load-bearing context. I find that to be kind of an amazing usage of that phrase. I'm one of 3 sisters, and I think about the concept of sistering to bolster the other as like a really powerful statement about women also in this context. This is a set of extracted wallpaper stripes that were painted back into a wall to have kind of like a raised plaster effect of surface. I was thinking about Braille and like a wall being able to hear something again, or to hear timelines. Walls are where we paint over our own histories over and over again. And even before you're there, somebody else has been there before you. And I was thinking a lot about the timelines that my sisters and I all have in different ways, but also the way that walls tend to embed people and history. This has also led me to projects that have to do with listening to the wall, which is something that you've probably seen somebody do at some time or other, where they can hold up a glass to a wall and actually listen through. The glass becomes like an echo chamber to listen through the wall to somebody else. And this is sort of a nod to the fact that I lived in a row home in South Philadelphia that literally had a side-by-side party wall relationship with our neighbors. You could literally hold up a glass and like hear the next person over. This is wainscoting that is basically cut to fit the inside of a set of headphones. And what you can't hear in this particular piece is that it was actually, there was a tiny little audio component inside of it that was playing back a recorded AM, like an AM station dialing through itself and catching a station for a period of time. So if you stood in front of it and you listened closely, you could actually listen to the object listening to itself. I've had an association with these headphones over a long period of time because as I was growing up, my parents, I think as a young married couple, had found this set of Pioneer Mimi headphones that we in our house had for years that you could hook up to the record player to listen to. And they were always a dated object in a way, but everybody in my family used them to listen to records, and it always left me with a feeling about this particular object and looking for it again. These headphones have appeared in my work several times, but it has a lot to do with listening to history. This is a piece that you may have seen in the advertisement for this talk, which I just want to send a shout out to Sharon Church. Sharon Church was one of my professors at UArts when I was a student there and taught me how to use a coping saw, which changed my life. A coping saw and a jeweler's saw, and that has impacted my ability to move into metal as a material. This is an object that it took about 8 different objects to make a composite of 3. And it's using the idea of a repeat pattern in textile breaks, but also the idea of thinking through how metal can continue to itself. This is what the backside of this piece looks like, which is supposed to obviously be a 2-eyed object. But there are a set of pocket opera glasses in case you're wondering what's going on here. Listening to the wall and listening to objects using broken technology and functioning technology, like one to speak for the other. All 3 of these playback components had 3 different audio files running through them that were found also in a junkyard out of context. And some of them are speaking on behalf of others, but you'll notice that's the same set of headphones running through all 3. Again, I've been on a quest to find as many of these headphones as I can, and they keep showing up in my work. I think through repeat patterns and putting things back together again, this is using a jeweler's sensibility, but on an architectural scale of piercing through found material. This is salvaged material that was found in the junkyard that was pierced and put back together again to lock the repeat back into position. Other pieces that I have worked on that have been major undertakings have to do with architectural installations that are full scale. It's interesting to talk to a group of people here that work in a scale in relation to the body, because I think of architecture as being a scale that holds the body. I've been building these types of rooms that have sightlines that are very specific built into them. This is the whole piece of this, which is called The Light I'll Be in 1983, was based off of the fact that my parents, after about 35 years of living in the same home in northern New Jersey, moved, and in the process of moving, excavated this found video that nobody knew they had, which was from an old family anniversary party. It was a golden anniversary party in Long Island in 1983 that I remember attending as a child. And getting the chance to watch this video again reanimated all these people in our family that have since been gone for a long time. We had a large group of that generation pass away in the late 80s and the early 90s. And since then, there's been sort of this hole in our history. And being able to watch this movie and to see these people reanimated woke up a lot of memories about that time, and also propelled me to want to make this architectural installation that took the view and sightline of the video camera that was positioned at the corner of the room during the party to make a piece that was in response to it. Because what happened with this piece is that the camera was bumped into multiple times during the course of the party, and nobody was paying attention necessarily to it because they didn't know how to use it. They had gotten the camera and they set it up and sort of let it run. And what happened is that partygoers would bump into it and set it off course. And for about 10 minutes, it would be staring at the corner of the ceiling for no particular reason until someone realized it wasn't looking at anything. And then they would reposition the camera and zoom in and look at the crowd. And you can see the way people are dressed, how they greeted each other. It was all very familiar, being able to see them again. And so I made this piece that had these deep sidelines that were based on that space, but with the people not being there. And this is one view, another sideline as you walked around it. This was about 18 feet long and 9 feet wide and 8 feet tall. And it was built like a giant puzzle piece that had about 80 components that were put back together again. You'll note the fact that like the perimeter of this matches the perimeter of the room. I wanted the piece to actually disappear into the space, even for the grand scale that it was at. Sidelines had details like this that you can only see by yourself. It was important to me that the photo line, the sight line of it, felt like a photograph you were looking at alone. It wasn't meant for more than one person to look at a time. These have like a rather cinematic feel to them, but they really are based on like photography moments of space. All of the interior siding and material that was used from this was repurposed. I have friends who work in demolition in Philadelphia and also who are in first-time homeowners that are renovating, and I will appear with a crowbar and take all of it down if they let me. So I've been removing surfaces from other people's homes now for a little while, and I have this accumulated pile of architectural material that I usually work back into. This is an audio piece that was also based on that had to do with listening to the footage of that film, and there were 5 sections of music. You'll notice these are the Pioneer mini headphones again, that had these sort of speaker-like sculptures that you could walk up to and listen to the sound that. So I never wanted to actually show the video work because I didn't think that was appropriate for this piece. It was more about making an echo in several different iterations. Photography, these are stills that were taken from the actual footage. In one really amazing moment in this footage, I captured a picture of my father taking a photograph of the actual camera recording, which is the picture on the left. I can't believe that actually happened in this, like based on what I just said before about a sideline hardening the experience between 2 people. I know for a fact that the picture he's taking here is actually of another person, another family member who's behind the video camera that hated having her picture taken. And I know this because I know the picture that was taken on the other side of this. So it's amazing to me, like moments like this live in multiple iterations and echoes of one another. This is a piece that was also in that show that was based on found vinyl, meaning that this was a seat cover that I found in a junkyard that was had aged, has ambered itself into this yellow, which was pretty unbelievable to me. I was thinking about the yellowing of the film when I made this and how everything yellows in time. White becomes yellow, especially white plastic becomes yellow eventually. And this was based on a wedding anniversary bouquet, a cascading bouquet, which is a style of a bridal bouquet. I think about material as metaphor when I work this way. This was all free motion sewn on the sewing machine, and it actually, I unexpectedly realized as I was playing with this that the work I was making in this way was actually creating a projection of time, much like the film itself. So the pictures that happen like sort of behind the scenes are very important to me along the way when I'm working on artwork. I think about repeat patterns as being something that broken repeat patterns can wake back up and blink. This affected some work that comes later that has to do with putting broken parts back together again. I really depend on missing information in my artwork. Some other work that includes a sewn practice that I have has to do with garment work that has been encased inside of vinyl. I have, it's a little hard to tell in this photograph, but this is a deeply sewn into garment where I took all the parts apart and sewed the weaving structure back into it in between 2 layers of vinyl to create this sort of intensified seat cover on top of an actual garment. This is called Youth Guild because the name of the inside of the ensemble itself actually is called Youth Guild. That was the name of the company that made the garment. I'm really interested in the absent body and how it shows up in fashion, but also in architecture, as you can see. Larger pieces that have been made about architectural broken fragments include Raise, which was a piece that was made of broken linoleum flooring. I have a body of work I've been working on for the past 5 years or so that has to do with collecting broken fragments and then putting them back together in a way that wakes the repeat pattern back up, almost in a way where the pattern's trying to rebuild itself. These are pieces that just happened this past year that were shown at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Arlington. This is a piece called telegrapher, which is actually a word that's used in resilient flooring language, which has to do with the way the architecture of the building can somehow, or can sometimes show up in the actual flooring itself if there's no barrier to catch the, what would you call it? Vibration of the floor, of walking on the floor. Like eventually patterns that are underneath in structure will show up in the flooring itself. These have a rather tectonic body to them. I think a lot about like breaking as being up and down. In American homes, and I'm sure this is true abroad, if you get involved with linoleum, you often have linoleum on top of more linoleum with other types of flooring sandwiched in between, because people change their fashions and their ideas. And over time, renovating, when you have to cut down through all that, you'll cut down through this composite of other people's history. So I'm thinking a lot about recontextualizing what that means to find it, and also to find it broken and to put it back together again. This is another piece called Springer, which is based on the same idea of taking a repeat pattern that is hardwired in one direction and to sort of force it to go the opposite direction. All of these repeat patterns were in a textile layout that felt more like a carpet pattern and less like a collection. I collage these works deeply and build them in such a way that they come off the wall about 6 inches. So there's sort of optical, a drop shadow that follows behind them. They have a sight line that's sort of as intense as the other pieces that I've shown today. The last piece that I'm just going to talk about is one of the things that I finished recently, which was at the Museum of Contemporary Art Arlington, which was another architectural build in a cube format. And this was based on attending an estate sale of 2 older neighbors on our block that had passed away within 2 months of each other. They were married about 75 years, which was extraordinary. And I found myself there standing in their house while an estate person who was coming through to sell, an auctioneer was coming through to sell all of the belongings, because the family didn't want to deal with getting rid of the work or any of the objects. They just let people in, and he would point to an entire room and say, "Name your price," for the whole thing, everything in this space. And it had left me thinking about other people's things, and how my husband and I have also accumulated our own collection of other people's things and also of our own. This one had 2 sight lines that were very specific, that had objects inside of it that were from our own collection. My sense of nostalgia includes things that happened last year. I think everybody's sense of time has been shaken by the last 3 years, for sure, because of the pandemic. And I'm thinking about what it means now to have timelines that sit on top of each other in a different kind of way, not so much about a long distance run of, generational time and gap, but, nostalgia that comes from 3 or 4 years ago. This is a specific piece that has a lot of interior work to it. There's 2 sight lines that exist to approach the views. It was made in such a way that it had, like, the white line, the crop line, or the crop of the wall is very tight, which gives you a restriction that you cannot physically enter these spaces. They're built kind of like the width of a photograph to look into. And objects that have been collected over time, all of these were chosen specifically to speak to like a tight space, a space of doubling, a space where things quietly accumulate. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Christina. That was really lovely. I mean, obviously, I already have revealed I'm a big fan of your work, but I hope you have some new fans after today. Getting a lot of thank yous and some incredible work. Katya Toporski says, "What a great lecture and great work. Thank you so much." Just a comment. I grew up in Germany in the 1980s, visiting my grandparents in the industrial Ruhr Valley. In that area, they still had a lot of empty spaces from the bombings of the Second World War. Often parts of the insides of the now gone rooms were still visible on the walls of the buildings left standing. All the signs of lives lived were on display like a giant billboard. A lot of your talk had me remember this. Yeah, I can imagine that, like sort of like kind of layers of a building being removed and what you could see. And it's interesting to think about it from the perspective of like bombing, right? And after a war, like what is revealed and like the context of that the process of that revelation.
Thank you so much for sharing that.
Mary Rayville says, "Blown away." With some hearts and wells. All right. And then Allison is making a comment that you can see that in Baltimore sometimes too, when one row home is taken down. And Allison, that comment reminds me of maybe this happens in Philly too, Christina. Like sometimes people will want to renovate a house, but they want to maintain the historic tax credit. So they'll keep only the facade. So it's kind of like the reverse. Like you'll see just this like front and this sheet of house and nothing behind it, right? Which is kind of the opposite of what you're doing.
It was interesting preparing the slides for this particular talk because I knew I was going to be speaking to an international room. And, you know, the great gift that comes from being asked to talk about your work really comes from thinking about who's listening and how it frames kind of the edge of what you're talking about. I realized how American my work is, you know, like how not only American, but how Northeastern American it is.
Can you say a little bit more about that? About like, are you talking more about like the pieces that are like the spaces or the linoleum or?
Well, it's a little bit of both because America's history has this relationship, and I've been thinking about this a lot in relation to the college students that I work with today, that I mean, this is a much larger conversation, but I think about the context of America as being a place where there's a lot of missing information that is sometimes by design and then also by force, and by missing information in general of starting over again, and echoes of other places. When I went into my deep dive on the history of linoleum, which is something I did this last year, I went through 3 different archives. I was on my first sabbatical from teaching, and I got the chance to really learn where this material was coming from that I was spending so much time on. And it took me through this really interesting start of the Northeast, working in, you know, Wilmington, Delaware, and realizing that there was a presence in not only Pennsylvania, but New Jersey and Delaware of linoleum factories. But then when I started reaching further past that, I realized that the origin of this story actually comes from Northern Scotland. And I traveled there to go to a museum to go study what that meant and like what that trade meant over there. And it was kind of amazing to watch what happened when it came to the United States and how much cheaper it got and how much more reduced the designs were when by the time they reached the market of the crowd that would have been interested in buying the product at that time. So there's something about an American context as a thing to acknowledge, and not only materiality, but like how things are made, that it had me thinking about it because I knew I'd be talking to an international room today. So thank you for letting me do that. It's always interesting to present.
It makes me think 2 things. One, just like how there might be some connections when Elizabeth Boucher, who's our final speaker, does her talk, from the Netherlands, and doing some research in Belgium as well. But I only recently learned, probably a few years ago, we have a supporter of the BJC, is technically our landlord, who is a historian of cities, and he has a book called The Buildings or the Homes of the North Atlantic, of just like how similar like Richmond, Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, like that architecture is to like Northwestern Europe. Something I never really thought about, and it makes me think about what is the flooring like you know, in Europe. And I was really compelled by the talk that you gave in the spring or early summer about like the sort of materiality of the linoleum. Like I'd never really thought about linoleum as a fiber, or like how it grows, like how the parts grow. And yeah, it's just really interesting what we don't know about the materials that surround us.
Yeah, the thing that came up that was interesting about that talk that I did then, which I didn't get into today, but and I was so pleased to realize that the origin of all of it really comes back to a fiber.
Yeah.
You know, because I'm speaking through you know, photography and architecture and materiality and craft, and as I said, my definition of putting all them together is really expansive, but it was really shocking and a full circle moment for me when I realized that the origin of linoleum comes from the flax plant. That to me was just unbelievable, like knowing how flax is processed and also how flax becomes a spun line. And the original version of linoleum, which was made in 1864, which is shocking to find out, actually had real flax on the back of it as a woven ground to push the material into before it was printed on. So, wow, right?
Yeah, totally. Wow. So Margot Tifa said, loved your talk. You're using a lot of evocative language in your work, stuff like twinning, blinking. I'm curious if there's a role of writing or reading to your process.
Yes, 100% yes. It's interesting that you asked this question because the origin of this work, you know, if when you go to grad school, there's always that one question that's, you know, somebody says, which is such a classic grad school question, can you make a piece about the work inside of your work? You know, like it's one of those like deeply reflective questions. And somebody asked me that question, and actually my answer was to write poetry, because I was reading a lot of William Carlos Williams at the time and Philip Levine, who was one of my favorite Detroit poets. I went to Cranbrook Academy of Art for grad school, and it left a deep impression on me about space in the Midwest. And Philip Levine is one of the great Michigan, Detroit poets of his era, and also had this incredibly photographic way of describing details, like how he would paint a picture with his words. He would zoom in so tight on certain details as if you were looking through a camera lens, actually. And I started to make these correlations between seam lines and the way poems are read differently on the paper than they are out loud. And I think a lot about that, about like the difference between the pacing, like the visual and spatial experience of reading a poem on a page, and how what might be broken thoughts are sharing space on a page in the way that they line up to one another. That gave me the metaphor for architecture and like how to put seams together that don't match, or how to like join timelines that don't come from the same place. Studying poetry actually gave me the idea to think about that in terms of space because of who I was listening to.
Yeah.
Reading William Carlos Williams. I'm drawn to him because he, you know, has his relationship to Northern New Jersey, which I am from. So there's something about time and place, and also the fact that he was a pediatrician and a family doctor that was writing as a creative writer. I love the fact that he walked in every day and was using his observations of people and their ailments as a place to study and to listen and to metabolize that and think it through it as a moment of grace, you know, in his writing. So I think about that a lot. I really appreciate that question that you thought about that.
There's got several more questions, so I'll keep going. Jay Diamond says, I'm really interested in the dynamic in the framed pieces where the viewer becomes a voyeur into what would otherwise ostensibly be a private space, especially when considering in context the inside and outside window pieces. So not really a question, more of a comment. Do you want to speak to that at all?
It's interesting, as I've watched people walk up to these architectural installations, they know that it's a boundary they're not supposed to pass. They know that they're not even supposed to put their hand inside of it. Occasionally, I do have one person who just can't help themselves, and they'll put their hand in because they need to understand the space by touching it. And it's built to such a point that if they do try to reach anything, it's not going to move. I lock everything shut, so I'm always thinking about delay, you know, slowing someone down and making them study alone for a second. That's very important to me, because the views are built in such a way that if you did see it, you'd have to talk to somebody else about what you saw. You can't see it at the same time with another person. That's super deliberate on my point. So it has to do with experiencing something alone, which is kind of like a really existential and lonely idea. But also I think it's kind of beautiful to suggest that, you know, we all carry our experiences as our own memories, and they're all true. Like, you were there, I was there. Yeah. I remember, I think about people as being there in objects that I, you know, find in an out of context setting. People are in everything.
Well, and on that note, Sophie McGuire said, wanted you to talk a bit more about voyeurism, which you just did, both in making the audience viewer, but also in how you use the remains of lived lives. So can you maybe talk about that, talk to that last part? Like, I like that, Sophie, the remains of lived lives.
I don't want to forget that people, like, I think it might be because I lost so many people as a teenager in my own family that I have this obsession with holding things, or like not losing them. Just a tangent, as a teenager, you know, in my family, it's a responsibility that we take on, and when someone passes away, the family goes to the site and cleans out the house. It's not an anonymous job, like the family does that. And I found myself at age 16 going through an upstairs cabinet that was just a piece of furniture off to the side and I was alone looking through it, and I came across what could be considered, or what I recognized at the time. I was 16, but I knew I was looking at what one could call lovers' photographs, meaning that it was a picture of my grandfather that was rather amorous. It wasn't like a private photograph or anything. I just had a feeling about it where I knew that he was looking at my grandmother, and she was the one that took that picture. It was very obvious to me. My first reaction as a 16-year-old was to hold on to it and to make sure that, like, I know that I saw that, and I didn't want it to get lost again, because it was a physical capture of the two of them looking at each other, and that blew my mind at that time. I just think about, like, it started in a personal space like that, of like realizing my own family was a starting point from this, but I've also grown to understand that people are on everything, like I just said. So like I look for it in other objects of like somebody else's mark. Like when I work in clothing, I'm often thinking about other people's stains. You know, they were there at one point. And actually, that's usually the most valuable part of the garment, is the receipt of somebody else's time. So I always try to hold that as being actually one of the more important elements of the work that I make.
I like these phrases, receipt of someone's time. So Elliot said, I wonder how you think, this is interesting, how you think of the concept of the multiverse or alternate realities, because it's becoming extremely prevalent in popular culture in recent years. I loved your presentation. I think I make so many connections to Gordon Matta Clark, from the materials to some common concepts to some installation methods. So I also wonder if you can connect his work. So
yes. Oh yes. Yeah, that had a huge impact on me, particularly the work of his where he cuts a house in half and cracks it open just a fraction, and then takes a video of looking at the seam line break, because he would break seam lines in places where they really weren't supposed to be, and cut holes down through things that almost had like a photographic crop. He is a favorite of mine, also because he did that amazing sort of B-sides project where he literally went through the Register of New York to own marginal pieces of land or landscape that would be like the corner of a triangle of space that was in between two houses that was only like 2 feet by 3 feet in space. Like he recognized all the spaces in between as being something to point an arrow to. And I think like studying him gave me a really a deep insight into looking at what's the periphery of things. I think that like studying him really had me thinking about that inverse. Like when I realized I was working in North Philly and they were taking those buildings down and like inevitably opening the pocket to the next house, that was a Gordon Matta Clark moment happening right in front of me, of a repeat being broken in an architectural setting. So yeah, I 100%. He's on my he's one of my art parents, if you will.
I love that. You're full of phrases we can continue to use after today. Any ideas, any thoughts on the metaverse? I mean, maybe you don't have any. I mean, I try not to think about it, so.
I don't even really know what that means. So I'm not sure.
Elliot, do you want to say anything about that? Do you clearly know what it means?
It's not like a new concept of like an alternate reality, but just that like a string theory in physics is kind of becoming like a trope in like Everything Everywhere All at Once, to the Marvel universe, to other like sci-fi and popular writing. It's like things will like split, and I think it's interesting to relate that like other people are thinking about this kind of thing in popular culture and interpreting it different ways of twinning or hidden timelines or many of the things that you talked about. And I wondered if you were aware of that or had thought about it.
Well, I'm not exactly on top of that. However, I would say that I did read The Three-Body Problem in the last year, which was unbelievable. So if you haven't read that book yet, 100% everyone should read that book. It's visually stunning. And the suggestion that it makes about timelines is unbelievable in a science fiction setting, but also in a very, it frames it in the Cultural Revolution of China, which is also an interesting lens to send it through. And I think that it had me thinking about the very normal time, normal experience as being a launch point for something profound. So yeah, I'm aware of it in that way, but I appreciate you bringing that up. It's nice. I'm taking notes during this too, because I have things to study after this is over.
I love that. Just like the ongoing commitment to your work. I apologize, Elliot. I might have said metaverse, which I also don't understand, but these are important things to be aware of. So Neve Coppersmith said, I'd love to hear more about your relationship with space and if it's changed throughout the ongoing pandemic.
It sped up my understanding of nostalgia. That's like the last piece that I just finished at the Museum of Contemporary Art Arlington, which by the way is going to go on the road soon. In January, it's going to be at Catskill Art Space in Livingston Manor, New York. I'm really pleased I'll be able to show that a second time. My understanding of nostalgia was compressed, because all of a sudden, I think like anyone's understanding of time got shifted pretty hard during that time of remembering when things happened. At school, we call it the before times, you know, like if students were still there and they're still finishing their degree now, like it's a completely different chapter. So I think that the pandemic intensified my understanding of time in a compressed way. And it's having me think about recent history on objects in a way that I had never thought about that before. That's a good question. Thank you.
Yeah. I'll just share two comments and then we'll wrap up for right now. So Mary Ravel said, I love the camera coated by several layers of paint. As you said, the layers of paint obscure some of the details of the camera. It made me wonder about the images taken by the camera that are not visible to me. And then Jean-Marie Martineau said, I love these glimpses into rooms not meant to be occupied, but evidence of being occupied. Taking on the perspective of a photograph, but with an additional perspective of movement of the viewer's body. It reminds me of the photo enhanced scene in the original Blade Runner film where Rick is able to zoom in around an open door in a photograph in a way that isn't currently available in a 2D photograph. Pretty magical. Well, great, wonderful, Christina. If there are more questions that folks come up with, we will circle back to them at the end. I am so glad that you were here, and we'll talk to you a little more in a bit.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Yeah, of course. So we're going to have just a 5-minute break. So everyone can get a snack or use the restroom. We will come back on exactly at 1:36. So see everyone then.